The structure of my presentation will be as follows. I will present you my thoughts within 6 points, and I will start right away with the first point. And I will start with the frame Islamic Comparative Theology. Comparative theology is a method to engage with other theological truth, which is not apologetic and provides methods and attitudes, Haltungen, which could be applied and practiced by members of different beliefs. So when that is the setting, then why Islamic comparative theology? What might be the need for an Islamic comparative theology? So what I'm not interested in using the frame Islamic in the context of comparative theology, but what I would like to do is to explore the possibilities for the method of comparative theology from an Islamic perspective. And I would add, avant la lettre, the following considerations. Comparative theology is already a well-established method of doing theology, but just to name a few of the recent scholars, it's Francis Clooney, it's Catherine Cornell, it's Marianne Moyer, and Klaus von Storch. So what I don't want to do is to reinvent the wheel, which already functions very well. When I was working, and I started working on this paper, I thought, and I wondered, I looked at the methods, I looked at the attitudes, I looked at the learning types, and I wondered whether I could add or omit something to make it Islamic. So I thought maybe I should include the frame, the term karama, which has the benefit to, on the one side, has the content of generosity in regard to be open to the truths of other faiths. And it has the meaning of dignity in regard to care in the process of doing comparative theology of one's own dignity and the dignity of the other. But then I was more interested in the why. Is there an Islamic convincing argument from the Islamic perspective to give grounds for why we are doing comparative theology, or why I am doing comparative theology from an Islamic perspective? And the why question was always aroused yesterday, as Yerusha mentioned it. So am I now just to justify comparative theology from an Islamic perspective? That would also be maybe not so interesting. So what I'm in is, and I have this certain assumption that to argue for doing comparative theology from different theological perspectives might have an impact on the concept of comparative theology itself and affects the contours of comparative theology. But this will be seen within the next years by practice. My next point is that I will offer you really a very little glimpse on the history of theological encounter, just to mention a few and to show, as an example, one problematic attitude, and to continue from there on, and that will be al-Ghazali. So I will just give an overview. That's not the attempt of my paper, but to set some notes to make it reasonable for you how I started and how I will continue, hopefully. So we can observe different kinds of engagement with the religious other in the history of Islamic thought, and Klaus von Storch mentioned yesterday some of them. So there is the observance to say there is no engagement. Yes, one's own belief is experienced as sufficient, and that could be a reasonable attitude. There is a plentiness within and a richness within the own religious tradition, so there is no need to engage with the other. And we have, of course, from the beginning until now, not just the no engagement, but also apologetic engagements. And there we can observe that the intention is to show one's own superiority of one's own believing system by devaluing the other. And there is a kind of more nuanced approach already seen in the systematic Islamic tradition. I'll not go into detail into the whole mystical tradition, which has its own benefits and challenges, but I will stick to the discourse which happened in the systematic theology, and I will unfold a bit the advantages and disadvantages of the following approach. And a more nuanced engagement is the following, and I will quote here al-Gazali as he's quoted in the work of Ibrahim Musa. Quote, "When Christians refer to God as the third of three, they do not mean that God is numerically three. Indeed, God is one in his essence, that, and three with respect to his attributes, sifat. And this is the wording of their statement. One in substance, jawhar, and three by way of hypostasis, opnomia. By hypostasis, they mean attributes." So, unquote, that's how al-Ghazali understands Trinity. And now Ibrahim Musa tries to understand the intention of al-Ghazali, and he first sums up what al-Ghazali is saying here. So according that would al-Ghazali say, to this standard, every monotheistic Christian committed to his doctrine follows the truth, albeit only in part, if he does not acknowledge the Prophet Muhammad as a prophet. So Ibrahim Musa tries to understand the intention behind that statement. What does al-Ghazali want to achieve by this? And he says, in his opinion, it's a kind of an emancipatory pluralism which he tries to develop in regard to handle the plurality within his Muslim community and above. And he says, quote, Ibrahim Musa, his purpose was to foster a broad-gauged epistemology, one that is susceptible to plurality. So that's al-Ghazali, and I can't leave it like this, so let me make just a short annotation. Al-Ghazali's understanding of Trinity may not be shared by Christian theologians in the past and today, except maybe the concept and the understanding of the Latin Trinity by Thomas Schertel, but not in mainstream Christian theology. So what we can detect here is a really good intention of al-Ghazali to handle the plurality of faith in the most appreciating way he was able to do, to include the other in one's own truth, but it turns out to be really counterproductive when it's based on a not adequate understanding of the other. And I think we may all agree that one of the goals of comparative theology is to understand the other as he, she wants to be understood, to be aware that including the other has its difficulties on its own in regard to maintain the dignity of the other. So, but I will still stick with al-Ghazali, but because since part of his way of doing theology, maybe not dealing with Christianity, but in the way how he deals with theology is very inspiring for our way how we do theology today, or can be when it's translated into nowadays challenges, can be a really inspiring way how to do theology, and therefore I will put a glimpse on the concept of Dihlis in al-Ghazali's teaching and on the concept of critical traditionalism as Ibrahim Musa develops it. So the concept of Dihlis and its quote of Ibrahim Musa, for this in-betweenness, this engagement with more than one intellectual and cultural tradition was precisely the source of his creativity and physic restlessness. So, and that translates into a vivid theology needs the other. So now we can figure out what the other may be. And I will give you some suggestions from my part during my now following presentation, and at least in my last slide. So now the reason for this detected vitality of theological thinking, as Ibrahim Musa detects it, seems to me to be an inspiration for him and others to establish a certain way of doing theology, which is framed and which is defined by the term critical traditionalism. Critical traditionalism is about the understanding that theology, ethics, and legal traditions are understood as works in progress. That there is an emphasis on the lived experience and experiences and modern science as important sources for doing theology. It's about to reinterpret Islamic teachings in the light of alternative methods in the humanities and social sciences. You see, I also lay the ground very traditionally why comparative theology is something we should buy in. And critical traditionalism is about to create, to detect criteria to disclose contexts, yes, and therefore the adverb critical stands for. Now, to let Ibrahim Musa speak for himself, and I will quote him times more, so his ears, I think, will shake right now since he's mentioned so often in this paper. And he said, "I do not advocate that one should view knowledge of the tradition as sacred and unchanging. Rather, it is subject to interrogation, correction, and advancement. For the upshot of all knowledge, it is not that it should be adored and worshipped, but that it must be put to use and result in practice. Therefore, the major question, if not the most challenging one, that arises is whether a practice has to perpetually resemble its origin. The answer to this rhetorical question is not easily subtle. The answer is negotiated in the tradition, the state of what one is, and more importantly, how one exists. So it's really an existential question in brackets. He's going on. One thing is for sure, tradition is definitely not a collection of texts. That would be only one source of knowledge of the tradition. Tradition is a state of mind and a set of embodied practices. And you will see why I just quoted this in the way I will continue, hopefully. Now, having said this, what I now dare to do is I try to practice critical traditionalism in what now follows. And I start with a key concept within Islamic theology, which is the concept of deen. And as we have already heard yesterday in the question coming from the digital audience and the response of Klaus is that religion in the European context and worldwide is a highly contested term. And it's not very clear what the term religion really covers and what not. So let me now present you my understanding of this term and present you why I understand deen as it will now follows. For me, deen is a setting and a practice, and I start with a definition following Fazlur Rahman. And related to his work, major themes of the Quran and other works and inspirations taken from other consideration, one can come up with the following systematization. Deen is a care, can be understood as a care for relations to oneself, other human beings, plants and animals, creation as a whole, and last but not least, to God. And in the thinking of Fazlur Rahman, haqq is the parameter that that shapes those relations. And what's interesting already in this frame, that there is a reciprocity within the term haq, because it depends on the preposition you put to the Arab term haq, that it can mean obligation or right. Haqqun alayhi, haqqun ilayhi. So we have relations which goes in both, which have a direction in both sides. Fazl Rahman, of course, starts with God. So, and I start with the human being. And that's already an interpretation of the theological work of Fazl Rahman. So I there follow teachings like that of Halima Krausen, and that already incorporates the insights of the anthropological turn. So I start with the human being, so I put the theory right around that, and then it's traditionally done. I would like to introduce also an insight of a philosopher, Emmanuel Levinas, who says the following: the face-to-face encounter with the other person raises an instantaneous ethical demand which involves unconditional responsibility for him and his life. So here we can see an interesting turn of the religious definition of deen into a philosophical language, which already covers a lot of what I've already just presented in how I defined deen in the first step. And now I would like to introduce once more an insight of Ibrahim Musa, when he says, he's coming from the teachings of al-Mawardi, and he develops the idea and the understanding that deen can be understood as salvation practice. And what's relevant here for me, for my theological thinking, that he puts together the horizontal relations and the vertical relations. The horizontal is about practice being ethical in regard to other people, to creation as a whole. And that incorporates already a relation in vertical direction to God. It could be understood as the way I am in contact with the other shapes my relation to God. So, and this is already in this title. I already show what the aim of my paper is, to understand comparative theology as a part of deen, inspired by the concept of resonance by Hartmut Rosa. Let me just introduce briefly Hartmut Rosa. He's one of the most famous sociologists in these days. He's widely accepted, and especially within his work on resonance, which is an 800-pager. And of course, there's also a critique on his attempt to give an explanation how to understand the human being within the world, and to provide a concept that could give answers to the question how to live a good life. And one of the critiques that's raised is that in the way he defines the term resonance, he encompasses nearly everything, which means nothing at the same time, which can cover anything. So the critique is that the term resonance remains vague. So I take this critique seriously, but nevertheless, I would like to offer you his insights to show you, and maybe to convince you, or you may convince me that it's not sufficient, that I see a very constructive potential within this frame, and let's see whether it's convincing or not. So, resonance, according to Hartmut Rosa, can happen in the following relations: horizontal, between oneself and the other human beings, the family, the political realm; dialogue, in a dialogue relation between oneself and things, for example, the job, and vertical between oneself and nature, history, and last but not least, religion, where I am, of course, interested in. Resonance includes, according to the understanding of Hartmut Rosa, the following aspects. It can be cognitive, affective, and corporal. Resonance, in his understanding, is not an echo, but a challenge to be transformed. It gives space for the resistance, die Widerständigkeit. I'm not sure whether resistance is really the right frame, so I mention the term Widerständigkeit. It gives space for the resistance of oneself and the other. It's not including, and therefore maybe doing unjust to the other person, maybe. Resonance, in the understanding of Hartmut Rosa, describes the capacity to be called upon and to get transformed through one's response. Resonance is understood then as the capacity to be in a responsively relation to the world. Why I have chosen this approach is it stresses the importance of human experiences. It's a phenomenological starting point. It's open to a broad audience. Everybody of us, whether religious or not, can share the experience of being in resonance with another human being, with nature, with listening to music, getting fulfillment from one's own job. This is something very democratic, and it starts from the basis. And God is not needed to be incorporated in the system to have a benefit from that system. It also enriches without taking God into this systematic. And why I've chosen this concept and this aspect to develop my thought is also because there is a movement from the people to God, which I like because it has a very democratic impact. And I will now offer you a quote from Hartmut Rosa, and I'm not sure whether I have translated it in an appropriate manner to the English language, so I added the German origin to be sure that the message and the content gets across. Quoting Hartmut Rosa is that establishing the social axis is sufficient to evoke the vertical axis. In Germany, dass die Etablierung der sozialen Achse genügt, die vertikale Achse hervorzurufen. And when in his book he deals with religion, he has the following reference in Matthew chapter 18, verse 20, "For when 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am there among them." And we have traditions within the Islamic tradition which would transport an analog content. So now that can be translated to a certain Islamic understanding of deen and enriches the understanding of deen, and maybe also shifts the importances from a traditional understanding to an understanding which can benefit our needs and our questions of today. One translation would be to serve God through serving people. And I think it's obvious that this interpretation and definition of religion, of deen, is inspired from Islamic liberational approaches, and it can be understood as a quintessence of Islamic teachings. Or it can be translated, and this is maybe one of the work we are doing as theologians, to try to figure out the best way how to put theological content into words that can transport this contents in the most best way, that fit the contents in the most best, in the best way. And it's a try and error, and my next try is, and there I take into account and get inspired by insights and impulses also from liberational theology, Islamic liberational theology, and the thoughts of Khalid Abul Fadl, and then Deen could be translated into to engage with God in engaging with people. So we have already seen that Deen can be understood as a care for relation, and it was already seen in the approach of Fazl al-Rahman. And to take this a step further, I will offer you another translation with the approach of Rosa in a religious setting as being in resonance with people, horizontal, constitutes the resonance with God, which is a vertical dimension. So, and I'm a little bit confused. How much time do I still have?
To ask also, it's 30 minutes, 10 minutes, yeah? So
I will finish earlier. Good. What are now the conclusions for a theological ground for comparative theology from an Islamic perspective? What are the theological implications? And here I need to introduce another thinker, and maybe it's not a surprise because when it's Charles Taylor, because it's very obvious that Hartmut Rosa is inspired by Charles Taylor. He did his PhD on the thinking of Charles Taylor, and for my conclusions, I need this following insight of Charles Taylor within his theory of expressivism. He explains the following, that expressing an inner impulse, a conviction, includes a transformation that concretes and enriches the inner impulse. So that it's not I think something, I feel something, and that is transported one by one in the world I act, in the world I practice, but in the way this impulse is expressed in regard and in the conversation with others, it goes through a transformative process. So there is a benefit in getting an inner impulse, conviction, a belief outside oneself. I think, and the conclusion of that would be that belief needs practice, and theology, as a reflection on belief, needs practice too. I think it's very clear when we imagine the situation, we try to figure out what the ritual prayer in Islamic tradition is about. We can read books, we can have an imagination of what it's be, which is comprehensive in its own dimensions, but it can never cover what can be learned by body. Bowing, prostrating within the ritual prayer is something I cannot achieve by thinking about it. So there is a benefit, an additional notion, which is just achieved, incorporated by practice. And I would also say that theology, the reflection of belief, needs practice, and I hope this experience is one that is shared, and it's not my own experience, but the inconsistencies of one's own thoughts, the lacks, the blind spots, and sometimes the silliness of what one thinks gets obvious when it's uttered in front of the other. I can have my best thoughts when I do a kind of armchair theology. It's not an argument to not theorize also in theology. I think there's a huge need to create comprehensive and reasonable approaches and systems. But I can have the best system being just occupied with my own thinking and don't recognize what I may lose, what I may have not taken completely into consideration. So then theology as a practice can also be understood as a part of Deen. And this goes back to an insight of liberation theology, Islamic liberation theology, where we have this idea of hermeneutical circle where religious practice, belief, the Quran, and theory are in a hermeneutical circle, and it's not really detectable where is the beginning and where there might be an end, because there is no end as a circle. And liberation theology would start and put the preference on the practice which informs theory. So now theological implications. And now you get maybe you see why I need to mention and tailor. The way how an inner impulse is expressed could depend on the surrounding, may it be the space, nature, or people. And Pim, you already draw our attention yesterday to that insight, to that experience. To be in resonance with a multitude of others could be understood as a way to do justice, haq, to the complexity and richness of oneself, of people and creation on the one side, and to the complexity and richness of the Creator on the other side. This could include the resonance with members of other faiths too, since the multiplicity of faiths could be understood as resonating with the multiplicity within God, when Tawheed is understood as unity in difference, following up specific notions of the Ash'ari theology. And now at the end, I will make 3 assumptions and 1 conclusion. The first assumption is a phenomenological one. Sorry.
The most important part.
I'm not, okay, we can talk about that. So my first assumption is that with whom one resonates theologically has an impact on the result. The second assumption is an anthropological one. The experience of comprehensive resonance can be understood as building the ground to experience oneself as comprehensive as possible. So it's a method and it's an experience which is identity building. And my third assumption is, I would say, a theological one. And it goes as follows: the more a person detects and realizes her identity, the more he or she gets aware of the presence of God. And to say this, I relate to the understanding of a quotation of Ash-Shatibi in his Al-Muwafaqat, when he says, Sharia, the way to God, is about to help human beings to get liberated from what is an obstacle within himself, herself, to be voluntarily a servant of God, since he or she is already a servant of God. So here we have also this horizontal and this vertical dimension. And last but not least, my conclusion is, now taking into account the definitions of Deen, which I try to explore in my slides, one could say that in the process of being in resonance with people of other faiths, God is worshipped. So that's a kind of worship too, and that would be, in my understanding, a reasonable motivation why one should do and engage with the faiths and truths of the other. So I think this was a kind of forced march. I hope for a vivid discussion. And for transparency, I have to admit that I haven't forwarded my slides in an appropriate time in advance to Abdul Rahman. I just wanted to say this for clarity and transparency. Thank you for your attention.